Most people never see the inside of a courtroom. Not really. Not as the person the room is built around. Not as the one sitting at the center of all that concentrated attention, waiting for a stranger with authority to speak out loud what your choices are going to cost you. Nancy Guthrie sat in that position, and in the hours immediately before her sentencing. In that heavy, charged, almost airless space where time moves differently than it does anywhere else. Something happened that no one in that room had fully prepared themselves for. Not a legal surprise, not a last-minute piece of evidence or a procedural development that altered the formal outcome. Something quieter than any of that, and in its own way more significant. Something that moved through the room slowly, the way certain things do, and settled into the people watching in a manner that formal proceedings almost never produce. The people who were there have spoken about it carefully, deliberately, with the restraint of people who are still, in some private part of themselves, processing what they witnessed. The words they choose are measured, considered, as though they understand, without having to say it, that what happened in that room deserves more than a quick summary, because what those final hours contained was not about the verdict that had already been reached. It was not about the sentence that was about to be handed down. It was about something underneath both of those things, something that the formal language of legal consequence can only partially reach. It was about a person finally arriving at the full truth of what had happened, what that arrival looks like when it happens in public, what it looks like when there is nowhere left to go, nothing left to hold on to, and no version of events left that the room will accept. That moment changed something in the people who witnessed it. It changed how they understood everything that had come before it. And once you hear what it was, once the full context is there, you will feel exactly why. To understand what those final hours meant, you have to go further back than the courtroom, further back than the investigation, further back than the first moment anything became official or documented or part of any record. You have to go back to the life that existed before all of that. The quiet, apparently unremarkable life that offered nothing from the outside. To suggest that it was moving anywhere serious, Nancy Guthrie was not a public figure. She was not someone whose life was watched or documented or subject to any particular scrutiny. She was simply a person, embedded in a community, known to the people around her, carrying the ordinary texture of a life built around relationships and routine, and the kind of daily presence that makes someone feel, to those who share it with them, permanent. She showed up. She was consistent. The people around her knew what to expect, and what they expected was what they received, day after day. In the unremarkable way that most of life actually operates, that ordinariness is, in retrospect, one of the most significant things about her story, because there was nothing on the surface of her daily life that indicated the presence of something serious underneath it. The people who loved her were not watching for warning signs, because no warning signs were visible. Nothing announced itself. Nothing asked to be looked at more carefully. She appeared, from every available angle, to be a person who was simply fine. But the proceedings that eventually unfolded told a different story. According to reports and documents that became part of the public record, the surface had not been the whole picture. Underneath the familiar rhythms of her days, according to those documents, circumstances had been developing that the people closest to her had not been permitted to see. Choices had been made quietly, privately, in the spaces that her ordinary life did not illuminate. Choices that accumulated over time into something that, once it was finally examined in the open, was considerably more serious than anyone outside of it had understood. The legal process that brought all of this into view took time. It was not a case that resolved quickly or cleanly, and it was not designed to. It moved with the weight of something layered, something that required careful, sustained work to establish fully, that produced developments along the way that surprised people who had been following it closely, and that demanded of everyone connected to it a kind of prolonged emotional presence that eventually becomes its own particular form of exhaustion. The people who were part of this story, not as observers, but as people genuinely affected by it, close enough to feel its weight in their daily lives, had been carrying it for longer than they would have chosen. They had moved through months of proceedings, absorbing details that arrived gradually and did not always land gently. By the time the sentencing hearing arrived, the exhaustion in the room was real, And alongside the exhaustion, something else, a quality of attention, so concentrated it was almost physical. The attention of people who have been waiting a very long time for something to finally be named. The moment came, and it was not what anyone in that room had expected. Before the case, before the investigation, before any of this had a name or a file number or a place inside any official record, there was just a life, and a life that looked, from the outside, like one that fit together. The accounts of people who knew Nancy Guthrie during the years that preceded all of this are consistent in ways that matter. They describe someone who occupied a recognizable role within her closest relationships and filled it reliably. She was present. She was capable. She understood her environment in the particular way that people develop after years of living inside a specific set of relationships, an intuitive fluency with the dynamics around her, a practiced sense of how to keep things stable and moving without friction. None of that was performance, as far as the people around her could tell. It was simply who she was in her world, the person they had come to know, and what they knew appeared, from day to day, to be consistent, complete, fully itself. Looking back at that period now, with the context that the proceedings eventually produced, those same people describe a quality they could not have named at the time, a weight she was carrying that did not show, a layer of her life that was not accessible to them, not through any failure of attention on their part, but because it was being actively kept from them, because the ordinary surface of her daily existence, the one they shared with her, was not the whole of it. According to what emerged through the course of legal proceedings, financial tensions had been a significant and ongoing source of pressure during this period. Questions about money, about property, about the specific, grinding kind of conflict that develops in close relationships when resources become contested, and conversations about them gradually acquire harder edges. These pressures were not part of the picture her people had been given. They were among the things being held back, part of the private architecture of her situation that the visible life did not reflect and was not intended to. The thing about situations that build slowly is that they do not announce themselves. There is no single day, no definitive moment, when the direction of the trajectory becomes obvious. There is only the continuation of ordinary time, day after day of unremarkable moments, while something beneath those moments moves toward a point of no return. That movement is invisible from the outside until it is not, and by the time it becomes visible, it has usually been moving for much longer than anyone watching had known. According to everyone closest to her, the period immediately before what happened was indistinguishable from any other period. Nothing stood out. Nothing asked for a second look. The last ordinary moments were ordinary in every way. Just another set of days. Just another series of unremarkable goodbyes that felt, as they always had, like the kind you never have to think twice about. The first sign that something was wrong did not come with any force. It arrived sideways, the way the most significant things often do, embedded in something small, something that could easily have been explained away if anyone had been inclined to explain it away, rather than look at it directly. What it was, according to reports, was a discrepancy, a single detail that did not align with the account that had been offered of it. In isolation, it was the kind of thing that close relationships absorb routinely, the minor inconsistencies that accumulate over years of shared life and rarely mean anything serious. In isolation, it probably would have been absorbed. The people who first noticed it responded the way most people do when they encounter something that makes them uncomfortable about someone they care about. They looked for the explanation that made it fine. They extended the benefit of the doubt that care produces in people who are not yet ready to reach for the alternative. They tried, in good faith, to find the angle from which the concerning thing looked unconcerning. It didn't hold. According to investigators and documents from the proceedings, what the initial discrepancy revealed, when it was examined more carefully, was that it was not isolated. It connected to other things. Each thread that was pulled revealed another thread. Each question that received an answer produced two more questions. And the picture that assembled itself through that process was not the picture that the charitable reading had been moving toward. It was something different, something with considerably more history to it than the original presenting circumstances. The accumulation of detail that came through this expansion was its own particular difficulty. Individual pieces could be absorbed, processed, integrated into a revised understanding. But the accumulation, the way the pieces fit together, the way each new one made the overall picture more complete, and therefore less deniable, pressed against the limits of what the people receiving it could take in at once. It asked more of them than any single revelation would have, because it asked them to hold an understanding that kept growing and kept requiring revision, and kept demonstrating, with each new piece, that what had been happening had been more sustained and more deliberate than the previous version of their understanding had acknowledged. According to reports, one of the things the expanding investigation brought into sharper focus was the degree to which what had happened had been a matter of ongoing, conscious choice. That distinction between something that developed through circumstances and something that was actively chosen and rechosen over time is not a minor one. It changes the fundamental character of what is being understood. It changes what it means to the people who were closest to it, who now have to reckon not just with what happened, but with what it implies about the sustained, deliberate nature of it. Questions were raised, according to reports, about the full extent and duration of the situation. No official conclusion has been reached on every dimension of those questions, but the shape of what investigators had built was no longer ambiguous in its general outline. By the time the case reached its final stage, the people closest to it had spent months absorbing that shape. They were not surprised by what the evidence established. They were waiting, simply, for the formal world to catch up with what the evidence had already made clear to them. There are moments in courtrooms that function differently from all the other moments in courtrooms, not because of what they formally determine, not because they add a new finding to the record, or alter the trajectory of the proceedings, but because of what they do to the room, to the people sitting in it, to the quality of air and attention and collective understanding in a space that had been building toward something for a long time. This case had one of those moments in the period immediately preceding sentencing. According to reports, something came to the surface during this final phase that had not been fully established before. What it concerned, at its core, was knowledge, not new facts about what had happened, but something about the nature of the doing, about what had been known and when, and what had been done in full awareness of that knowledge, a detail about consciousness, about the degree to which everything that had been built over the course of the proceedings had been built in full understanding of what it was, that distinction between harm that occurs through failure and harm that is chosen through understanding is one of the deepest that can be drawn in a situation like this one. It changes not just the legal weight of what happened, but the human weight. It changes what it means to the people who were hurt by it to understand that the person responsible had known, at every point, exactly what they were doing, that the ordinary days those people believed they were sharing had been inhabited, from the inside, by someone who was fully aware of the difference between the life being shown to them and the life actually being lived. The people in the room felt this when it arrived, not dramatically, not with the visible emotional reactions that people imagine courtrooms produce, with something quieter and more lasting, a stillness that settled over the space as the last available alternative explanation finally ran out. The specific quality of a room in which the thing that hope had been holding at bay is no longer at bay, is simply present, real, already inside the space with everyone in it. For Nancy Guthrie, that moment had its own particular texture. Whatever distance had been maintained between the version of events she had carried into those proceedings and the version the evidence described, whatever internal separation had existed between those two things, this was the point at which that separation closed, publicly, in front of everyone who had been part of the process from the beginning. There was no further management available, no angle left to approach it from, only the experience of the closing. And those who watched have said, carefully, that it showed. A verdict and a sentencing are not the same moment. They do not feel the same, and they do not mean the same thing to the people who sit through both of them. A verdict is a determination. It answers the question the legal process was built to answer. A sentencing is something more personal than that, more immediate, more concrete, more unavoidably real. It is the moment when consequence stops being abstract when the weight of what has been established becomes something that a specific person has to carry in a specific and practical way going forward. It is the moment when the question shifts from what happened to what happens now. By the time Nancy Guthrie sat in that room for the last proceeding, everything that the case had built was already part of the record. The investigation had run its course. The detail that had shifted the frame of understanding had been placed alongside everything else. What remained was the naming of consequence and the atmosphere of a room where everyone present understood what they were waiting for, according to those who were there. That atmosphere was real and palpable, a weight in the air that did not belong to any individual in the room, but was produced by all of them together by the shared understanding of what was about to be said. The quality of attention in a space where something irreversible is approaching, something that, once it arrives, changes the practical shape of a life in ways that cannot be taken back. The signals visible in Nancy Guthrie in those final minutes, in her posture, in the quality of her stillness, in the way she occupied the room, were readable to the people watching her. They described someone who had arrived at the end of navigating, someone for whom the long process of managing had finally, completely run out of available space. The composure that had been present through various earlier stages of the proceedings was present differently now, or perhaps not present in the same way at all. Something had settled. Something had stopped. What the detail that had emerged brought to those final minutes was not new facts. It brought meaning. It transformed the sentencing from the conclusion of a legal process into the public acknowledgement of something that had been real for a very long time, something that had been running through the ordinary seeming surface of her life, according to the evidence, far longer than anyone outside of it had been permitted to know. The law was giving it a name, and the naming of it, in that room, with all the weight of everything that had built up to it, landed with a fullness that the formal language of legal proceedings can only partially contain. When a long case finally ends, what people feel is rarely what they had expected to feel. For those who were closest to it, who carried the weight of it through all the months, and all the proceedings, and all the gradual, difficult emergence of things they had not known, the end is not relief in any clean sense. Relief suggests return, and there is no return. What there is instead is a release of the specific sustained tension that long uncertainty produces in a person, a loosening of something that had been held tightly for a very long time. Not restoration, just the particular release of a grip you had forgotten you were maintaining. What comes after that release is the actual work, the private, ongoing, structureless work that no formal proceeding attempts and none of them complete. The work of carrying forward the full picture, the one that is so much larger and more deliberate than the picture that existed before the process began, and finding some way to integrate it into the understanding of a person, a shared history, a set of years that now have to be held differently than they were held before, the moment that defined those final hours before sentencing, the one that the people who witnessed it have spoken about with such careful restraint, will stay with them in the way that honest things stay, not because of its drama, because of the complete absence of it, because it was the most unmanaged, unguarded, fully real thing that happened in that room across the entire course of the proceedings. A person at the end of everything they had been doing to protect themselves from this moment, visible in a way they had not been visible before, present in the room, finally, as themselves. Cases like this one leave behind a question that belongs to everyone who was part of them, and to no one who wasn't. It is not a legal question. It does not have a procedural form or a formal answer. It is the question that life asks when something like this surfaces inside the ordinary. The question about what we are actually trusting when we trust the people we share our days with, about the distance between the version of a person we are given and the fuller reality we are not always permitted to see, about what it costs and what it means, when that distance turns out to have been considerably larger than we had any reason to suspect. That question does not resolve with a sentencing. It settles into the people who were part of the story and becomes part of how they move through familiar things going forward, part of the attention they bring to ordinary moments, part of what they notice and what they no longer simply assume, and what they